Suicide is a tough topic, but the Washington County Reach for Hope Suicide Prevention Coalition wants you to know that there is always hope. We are a caring community reaching out to provide compassion and hope for a community free of suicide. In the next half hour, we'll talk with community partners to identify risk factors, raise awareness, and discuss prevention strategies. Hello and welcome to another edition of Reach for Hope, where there's always hope. I'm Melissa Anderson. You know, this is a suicide prevention program that is informational to people about help that's available out there before a person takes their own life. With us today to talk about the MCOT, or Mobile Crisis Outreach Team, that deals with some suicidal calls or other behavioral health crisis, is Roger Nelson. Welcome to Roger, and thanks for joining us. And I understand you work for the Southwest Behavioral Health Center here in St. George, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Tell us a little bit about what is MCOT and what is it based around?
Okay, so yeah, it's the Mobile Crisis Outreach Team. And so we go mobile if we need to, dealing with situations where there's a mental health issue at hand, whether that's like somebody who might be feeling suicidal or mood disorder or like thought disorders, so hallucinations, stuff like that. So, but any kind of mental health crisis, then that's what we respond to.
So, do you just serve this immediate area here, or who's on the team?
Okay, yeah. So we have two teams actually, one in Washington County and one in Iron County. We do serve the 5 southwest counties of Utah, Washington, Iron, Beaver, Garfield, and Kane County. Obviously, our mobile response is greatly delayed in some of those more rural frontier areas, but yeah, so we have two teams.
How long has this been around then?
It's an ever evolving thing. We've had MCOT's been around for 20 some odd years, and but it was mostly just not well known and not well utilized. And so since then we've evolved and we're far more utilized. We dispatched from like 911 calls directly, and people call us directly too.
Right. So what is your role on the team then?
So I'm the supervisor. I'm just kind of manage the staff and the programming and interface with the state level administrators.
How do you then get a call? How does this work? You said 911 calls. Just kind of walk us through what could happen and how that works.
Okay, so if a 911 dispatcher gets a call from a distressed individual, and 911 is able to determine that there's no law enforcement issue and there's relatively features of safety, then they'll ask us to respond instead of law enforcement, because sometimes law enforcement will escalate the individual, and so having somebody that's not there with a badge and a gun sometimes helps de-escalate just by presence alone.
So this isn't specifically for suicidal calls. It's for any kind of a crisis that might be maybe even domestic violence. I don't know.
Well, I think for the very nature of domestic violence, because there's violence involved, law enforcement would be the one to respond. That, and it's a crime. So, but there are times when we get asked to respond to kind of help with the aftermath. People that are like, okay, we have somebody going to jail, but we have people here that are kind of freaking out and just need a little bit of support.
Yeah. So do you respond to every single call? And you're probably on call 24 hours a day, correct? That's got to be a tough thing. Do you call people out on your team to go, or does your two teams, do they respond immediately?
Yeah. So we have 2 people on call at all times in the St. George office, and then 2 people on call at all times, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In our Cedar City office. And as we get called out, so we manage a lot of the crises over the phone. And then when we need to, if they just need that physical presence, or there's a lot more going on, then we'll respond and do what we can to help resolve those situations and bring more resources to the scene.
I was just curious, did you get more calls or less calls during the pandemic?
Oh, that's a really good question. The anticipation was that we would get a spike in calls. Initially, the calls just dropped off. It was a decrease in calls, but I think everybody was kind of freaking out on what's happening. The most surprising was we had a spike in calls from addicts, people that were like, can't get my substance, now I need treatment, give me help.
Wow.
So that was interesting. And then after the first month and a half, couple months, calls really picked up from there. People were kind of anticipating that it was going to be a short amount of time that, everything was shut down, and then there was a little bit of fatigue of everything being shut down.
Yeah, there's various reasons why people would be upset during that time frame. I mean, I for one was one too, because everything was kind of shut down and it was kind of weird. But do you work in tandem with the police then, and or in the sheriff's department, and they might call you out even after they get a call and you don't get the call?
Yeah, we get a lot of calls from law enforcement, and sometimes they're on the scene and they're like, "Hey, we have somebody who's clearly delusional or psychotic. Can you kind of help us with that situation?" And there's times when we call them out, when we're called by an individual or a family, and then when we get there, realize there's, a safety concern or they need that level of support from law enforcement.
Right. So is there ever a time that law enforcement would not be called out? You mentioned that earlier. I've heard of people that want suicide by cop.
Sure, and cops are well aware of that, and so if it's just a single individual, there's no other people in the situation, they might not respond. They might just have us respond, but they won't have us respond if the individual is armed, has like lethal means. So so we do there's times when we get called, actually frequently, where people want us to respond, and there's an intoxicated individual that's has weapons on them, and it's like, no, we're not going to respond to that without law enforcement clearing the scene.
Yeah, you need a backup plan there.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me a little bit about who's on your team. Do you have psychiatrists or, who's on there?
Yeah, good question. So we have clinicians. We have licensed mental health clinicians on the team. And then most of the rest are, we have a lot of peer support specialists, and they're people with lived mental health experiences, either themselves or family members that have had a serious mental health issue, addictions to substances, or a suicide in the family.
Right. And so at what point do you then kind of take a step back or step forward and recommend intervention in a case to where they might be taken somewhere?
Yeah, and that's a tough thing if we're talking like an adult subject who is having the mental health crisis. A lot of times they're not the ones that want the help, and they're not the ones calling, but their family is, and it's a tough thing to try to force somebody into treatment or force somebody into getting help. And in Utah, the individual has a lot of rights, and but there are we have pink sheets, and a lot of our team are licensed mental health officers, so we can pink sheet, but law enforcement can pink sheet as well. So if we deem that an individual meets that level of harm to, risk of harm to self or others, or is neglecting some of their activities of daily living, ADLs are called, because of their mental health issues, then they can be pink sheeted and transported to the hospital for further intervention, I guess.
Yeah. Well, we want to avoid those pink sheets. That's for sure, darn sure. So you have another role that you play. Tell us about the mobile response, SMR, stabilization and mobile response. How is that different from MCOT?
Okay. Yeah. So it's mostly with families that are struggling. Their kids are not following the rules, or parents just feel like some of their parenting skills are inadequate, but they're just struggling in maintaining, peace and harmony in the home. The services are offered to families with kids under 21, and it's more long term. Where mobile crisis outreach team, the MCOT, is dealing with immediate crises, within minutes to hours, and the SMR, the stabilization and mobile response, we can be involved with families for weeks and even to a few months.
And that's through the State Human Services Department?
Correct.
Now tell me, how do we know when a child is maybe possibly what we would call acting out versus how they'd be, like maybe in a crisis where they would need some mental support help?
Okay. Well, to be honest, anything that a parent deems as, we're struggling with our kid, either emotionally, like maybe that kid's not breaking any rules, they're going to school, they're attending everything, but just emotionally they're either withdrawn, they're depressed or whatever, we will provide support for that family for that as well. And then sometimes like if a kid's like, well, I'm just trying to get a free ride to Disneyland and not have to pay for it, sort of thing, like being sneaky or trying to being manipulative, then we help with that too. Either way, it doesn't matter to us what the issues are that are causing the parents concern. We'll support the parents and we'll support the family in addressing those concerns.
And it could be a communication issue between them and the parents, or it could be, like you said, manipulative, or just a. So how would a parent then reach out for help for that?
Okay, so we do have these pamphlets. We pump them out to schools and stuff, and we have, we get a lot of referrals from the state crisis line, just like MCOT does. But when they realize it's like a family in crisis, they'll refer to us, and then we have a number that we have out there. They can also call the main number for Southwest Center, and they can get directed that way as well. And
so they would call the number at Southwest Health?
Yeah, so it was the Southwest main number, that 435-632 or 634-5600, or our the SMR, and it's all crisis because we're one team that does both things, and that number's 435-414-4362.
Okay, good. Thank you for pointing that out. Now, so when your team arrives, what kind of items might you help them with and give out and support them with then?
Okay, yeah. Probably the number one thing is like weighted blankets, and as we run into individuals and families that they're stressed out, and there's a lot of things in our current rapid paced culture. People get pretty stressed out, and there's a process of they build up a lot of cortisol, and these weighted blankets help them produce oxytocin, which breaks down the cortisol and just helps them feel less stressed. And so we give out a lot of those. We have gun safes that we can give out for free as well to people who maybe just need to have like kitchen knives just stashed away. So families where maybe a youngster is feeling a little suicidal, but they want to have access to those kitchen knives for culinary purposes, but not access to their kids, and so they're biometric. They can open them with the fingerprint.
Yeah, and I saw, or we earlier just showed a picture of the Reach for Hope bags that the Reach for Hope gives out. How often have you given those out, and what's inside those?
So yeah, there's a fuzzy blanket. There's a couple of like a stress squeeze thing. There's information, and yeah, little things that for families to be able to engage with each other with,
as well as resources inside for further help. So what do you do then to help these individuals if you actually go on site to help them and talk to them about how do you reach out to them, and maybe they're going to need further help or not, but do your therapists go on site then? How does that work?
Yeah, so it's kind of a 5-step dance. And, the first is simply de-escalating them. Anything we can to just kind of help de-escalate. And maybe that's the process all the way through. But that first thing is listening, just listening, and then validating. Because it doesn't matter what they're experiencing, and how irrational it may sound or feel. It's their experience, and their experience needs to be validated. And it's interesting, if they keep repeating themselves, then we know that they're not feeling heard. So sometimes I'll just stop them and say, clearly you don't feel heard. Tell me again. Will you tell me one more time? And so that listening, validating, and then helping them to come up with options, like what are your options, and sometimes in a crisis, and part of the definition of a crisis is you need to make a decision, and a lot of times people just don't want to, or they don't feel like they have any choices, and then helping them to understand what their choices are, and especially when somebody's suicidal and they only see one option out, and it's like, well, you can always have that choice, but let's find others.
Right.
And so just helping them identify their options and then coming up with an action plan. That's that fifth step is what's your action plan?
So what kind of follow-up then do you do after that? Maybe you give them some options or they say, okay, good, thanks for jacking me down or whatever. And now how do you follow up with them and say, okay, how you doing?
Yeah.
I think that's important.
It's a great question, because I'll tell them, like, if things don't get better, and usually their action plan defines the time limit, right? And it's like, if their action plan is something that they can do in the next 20 minutes, then I'll say in the next 20 to 30 minutes, if things don't get better, call me back. And usually if we're there, it's like things are pretty chill before we leave the scene. And then, so based on the severity of that crisis, what the action plan is that they've committed to doing, will kind of dictate what we're going to do next. Like, and if I don't hear back, and sometimes I'll tell them, or we'll tell them, if we don't hear back in an hour, we'll call you back. Or if we don't hear back in a few hours, we're going to call you back and just see how you're doing. So it goes both ways. We sometimes we get a lot of calls back and say, yep, things are great. And sometimes we're the ones calling and they're like, yeah, that really helped.
You could be up all night doing that.
Yeah.
Figuring that out. I bet you probably have to have toothpicks to keep your eyes open. So when you do follow up, what kinds of things do you recommend them to do and not to do? I mean, you talked about the gun safes, so I imagine that you want to make sure that the lethal means of any kind are taken out of the home or not accessible,
right?
Either by family members or by yourself. I mean, I don't know how you do that, but...
Well, yeah, we don't really take possession of things, but we'll help facilitate them getting those. If they're youngsters, then the parents are more responsible for securing those things. And if there's a single individual, it is a little bit harder, but there are a number of different resources in our community to help them secure those things. And we will keep, if they want, if they're asking for us to secure some lethal means, we will.
And by lethal means, we mean firearms, alcohol, prescription medication,
sharp-edged instruments, yeah.
Anything that could be lethal. I mean, that's pretty much common sense, but a lot of people don't. They have that in their home all the time, so they don't think about it. So, so have we seen increases of these calls, these types of calls in our area recently?
We have, and it seems to be like waves of an ocean. There's rises and falls, but there's a general trend of uptick in calls that we receive, and a lot of that can be attributed to just the population is growing very rapidly. So it seems to be like the calls are increasing at a similar rate. Most recently, though, in the last few weeks, it seems like calls have been inordinately increased. So
is it because of the time of year and people are wanting to get out, or what?
Well, typically, summertime is a slower time. We always get a higher increase of psychotic kind of calls, suicidal calls, and mood disorder calls in the spring. When the temperature is changing, it's always a big time for big time calls. And then summertime, so towards the end of May and June, calls decrease a little bit. It's our slow time. We get a kind of, exhale.
What about the time, like during the full moon?
Before I did this. Is that a
misnomer?
Oh, no, it's not. It's true.
Really?
Yeah, before I did this, I'm like, the moon doesn't change shape or anything. It's the same size, whether it's full or not illuminated at all. But there's a reason why there's a term called lunatic. It comes from the moon. And so the theory is that there's way more like solar radiation because it's bouncing off the moon and hitting the earth. So whether you believe that or not, it seems to have some credence to crazier calls.
Gravitational pull, high tide, I don't know, something like that. But so are there certain ages that we're seeing more attempts from?
Yeah, younger and younger, or, adolescents and stuff like that, and maybe not attempts as much as the exclamation that they're
For your calls.
Mm-hmm. So then that part's kind of sad, and we see more elderly people than we did years and years ago, which it kind of surprises me a little bit. It seems like, you have these 60, 70-year-old people that, they've lived that long, they've kind of figured things out. But,
Yeah, could be financial though.
Sure.
Fixed income.
I think loneliness. In fact, that was
Oh.
I think I figured it out during COVID, is we had way more 60 to 80-year-old individuals feeling suicidal. And I think it was because they're more isolated.
Mm-hmm.
They had less people around because people weren't visiting each other
Right.
as much. And
Yeah.
so that one was, I'm like, what's going on? We have way more, geriatric callers in crisis than we'd ever had before.
Yeah. And we had shown a graph earlier that talked about middle-aged men, but in these calls, you're not experiencing that, so to speak.
That's a constant.
Oh, that's a constant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always get those.
If someone does experience a death in their home, is there help or support groups out there, or do you get calls on that as well?
Yeah, we do get calls, and a lot of times it's because they're in their own, emotional crisis at the moment, and so there's I don't know of too many groups per se. I mean, we're really kind of at the moment, but we do a lot of referrals to more long-term mental health situations. Our clinicians will actually provide some brief and temporary crisis therapy in the office, and we'll offer it. Like, we'll come to you, we'll meet you somewhere neutral, or you can come into our office for crisis therapy. But really the goal is to eliminate barriers to them accessing the more traditional long-term mental health services.
Right. What would you like the public to know about your crisis support teams?
That we're here, we're pretty passionate about doing what we do. It's in a small way, it kind of feels like being a hero, and it's kind of cool to hear people just say, oh my gosh, I just didn't realize I had any options. It's like, so we're not reinventing a wheel or anything, but in a crisis, you're just not, you're not your best version of yourself, and having somebody to just kind of be there and help you walk through some better thinking, clearer thinking, and come up with some of these solutions. It's just really cool. And
someone who cares, and oftentimes you might be in a PTSD moment where this has happened before, but you need that listening ear, somebody to hear me, right?
Yeah. And a lot of times you're exactly right. There's times when people are just talking, we're just listening and just validating, and they're like, thanks, that helped, I'm good. And
Yeah,
it's
you
like,
can leave
I didn't
now.
even do anything.
Yeah, you can, but you did.
Yeah.
You listened, and that's why it's important to stop and even talk to someone, on the roadside, or at a bench that might look lonely or have a problem, and you say, "Hey, how can I help you?" We need to all reach out, and that's what Reach for Hope's all about: is to reach out and listen. Because I think if we all did that as human beings, and said, "Hey, how's your day today?" and really be concerned about it, not just, "Hey, how's it going?" Maybe we could really hear what people are saying.
Yeah.
It seems such a simple answer, but not all of us do that all the time. Are you in need of volunteers, or how does somebody get involved with this?
Well, because of the nature of our business, everybody has to be screened through background screening and stuff like that. But we also have to be certified as crisis responders.
Right. So can't do that then.
Yeah, it's just.
I wondered. How can the public help support you then?
There's a couple things, and I'll say this, and I say it all the time, is, if anybody's needs your help, listen. And if they keep repeating themselves, they're not feeling heard. And not all the time do they want somebody to just jump right in and fix a problem, but just to listen. And sometimes, that's a lot. And then referring to us, I know we get a lot of families that will call and say, can you help my kid, or can you help so-and-so? And it's like, well, have them call, or we can cold call them. But
yeah,
just make referrals.
And how can they find out more?
Well, they can always get online. There's the Reach for Hope, of course, and
right.
Southwest Behavioral Health, and I think we're kind of going through a little bit of a website, upgrade. But yeah, or give us a call.
Great, thank you. Well, I'd just like to say thank you for joining us, and always we have the Reach for Hope hotline, 1-800-273-TALK, which people can reach out for, and we've got had a message on that before. So I'd just like to say thanks for joining us, Roger, and wish you well, and hope you get a little bit of shut-eye. But in the meantime, thank you for helping people. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks for joining us. And remember, there's always The Reach for Hope Coalition wants you to know that we care about you, and we are here to help. If you or someone you know is thinking about suicide, reach out. You're not alone. To access resources for yourself or others, visit our webpage at reachforhopeutah.org. That's reach4hopeutah.org. If you are experiencing a crisis, please call the Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK, because you matter and there is always hope.
This has been a production from A Podcast Studio.